The day Mirabelle Osei walked into Cook County Courthouse wearing a second-hand blazer and carrying a canvas tote bag. She looked like someone who had taken the wrong turn on the way to the DMV. That was exactly what Judge Roland Vance thought. She could tell from the way his eyes swept over her, a single dismissive flick, like you'd swipe away a notification you didn't ask for. She'd been on the receiving end of that look enough times in her 53 years to recognize it before it even fully formed on someone's face. The slight tightening at the corner of the mouth, the way the posture straightened, not out of respect but out of irritation, the kind of irritation a man feels when something he considers beneath him has the audacity to take up his time. Mirabelle set her canvas tote on the table and sat down. The courtroom was smaller than she expected for a county seat. Wood-paneled walls the color of old bourbon, fluorescent lights that buzzed just barely below the threshold of consciousness, and two flags, American and Illinois, standing at slightly different angles behind the bench, as though even they couldn't agree on something. The gallery held maybe 30 people. A few had the glazed patience of people who'd been here before. Others clutched folders like shields. She was here for her nephew, Dion. Dion Osei was 22 years old and had made one genuinely bad decision in an otherwise careful life. He'd been in a car with a friend who turned out to have a suspended license, and that friend had blown a stop sign, and somehow in the chaos of the traffic stop that followed, Dion had ended up charged with obstruction for allegedly not producing his ID quickly enough. The charge was thin. Anyone with a law degree in 10 minutes could see it. But thin charges had weight when the person holding the scale didn't feel like balancing it. Mirabelle had driven down from Evanston the night before. She hadn't told Dion she was coming. She hadn't told anyone. She just came. Judge Roland Vance had been on the bench for 11 years. He had a reputation. Not the kind that got written up in newspapers, but the kind that spread in courthouse hallways, in the break rooms of the public defender's office, in the quiet conversations between a lawyer and their client right before they walked through the doors. He was the kind of judge who ran his courtroom like a man who had confused efficiency with contempt. Cases moved fast. Motions got denied faster. And if you came into his courtroom without a tailored suit and a firm handshake, and a last name that rang some kind of bell, you could feel it. The slight but unmistakable temperature drop that said you are not quite real to me. Dion's public defender was a young woman named Carla Sims. Mirabelle had spoken to her briefly on the phone. Carla was competent, clearly tired, and managing a caseload that would have broken most people. She'd told Mirabelle the hearing was probably routine, a preliminary motion on discovery, and that there was no reason for family to be present. Mirabelle had thanked her and come anyway. She settled into her seat in the front row of the gallery, 3 feet behind the defense table. Dion came in through the side door, flanked by a court officer. When he saw her, his face did something complicated. Surprise, then gratitude, then the particular quiet dignity of a young man who refuses to look afraid in a room full of people waiting to see if he will. He gave her a small nod. She gave one cap back. Nothing more was needed. Judge Vance entered at 9:07. Bailiff called the room to order. Vance sat down, pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times, and began flipping through papers without once looking at the gallery. The hearing began. Carla stood up to present the discovery motion. She was clear, well organized, and cited the statute correctly. Mirabelle listened with the careful attention of someone who was not merely listening but cataloging, filing each moment in the part of her mind that never fully switched off. Judge Vance cut Carla off before she finished her second sentence. "Counsel, I've read the motion. The issue is whether your client complied with the lawful order of an officer of the law. I don't see how discovery changes that fundamental question." Your Honor, the body cam footage is central to establishing the timeline. The timeline is in the report. The report and the footage don't match on the 12-second gap between. Are you suggesting the officer fabricated a report, Ms. Sims? The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when a judge raises his voice, not in anger, but in warning. The way you'd turn up the volume on a radio to signal you're done discussing what station to listen to. Carla held her ground. I'm suggesting the footage may clarify. Motion is under consideration. Next matter. It was not next matter. There was no next matter. This was Dion's hearing. The judge had simply closed the door, mid-sentence. Mirabelle kept her hands folded in her lap. The prosecutor, a man named Garrett Pierce, mid-40s, pocket square, the kind of cufflinks you notice because they're meant to be noticed, rose to offer what he called additional context. What he offered was a summary of Dion's prior record, which consisted of a single dismissed charge from when Dion was 17 and had been mistakenly identified in connection with a theft he had nothing to do with. The charge had been dismissed completely, and yet there it sat, being placed on the table like evidence. Mirabelle's jaw tightened. She watched Dion's shoulders go slightly rigid. She watched Carla open her mouth to object. She watched Judge Vance wave a hand as if to say, yes, yes, noted, moving on. And then something happened that Mirabelle had not planned. Judge Vance looked directly at her. She wasn't sure what prompted it. Perhaps he'd registered her in his peripheral vision, and her stillness had irritated him. The way the stillness of someone who is not afraid can irritate a person who expects fear. Perhaps he simply felt her watching. Whatever the reason, he looked at her over the top of his glasses and said, "Ma'am, are you counsel?" "No, Your Honor." "Family?" "Yes." He stared at her for a moment, not long but long enough to be deliberate. "Well, this is a legal proceeding, not a church social. I'd ask you to refrain from any reactions that disrupt the dignity of this courtroom." Mirabelle had not made a sound. She had not changed her expression. She said simply, "Of course, Your Honor." Vance returned to his papers. In the row behind her, she heard someone shift in their seat. Beside her, a woman with a manila folder pressed to her chest, let out a breath through her nose, the kind of breath that meant "I saw that." What happened next was not immediate. Courts don't move quickly toward anything, including injustice. Carla filed a renewed request for the body cam footage. Pierce objected. There was back and forth. Procedural. Bloodless. The verbal equivalent of two people bumping into each other in a hallway and each refusing to step aside. Vance listened with the body language of a man waiting for a bus that was already late. At one point, he asked Pierce a clarifying question about the statute, and Pierce gave an answer that was, Mirabelle noted with quiet precision, incomplete. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete. It cited the code correctly, but omitted a 2019 amendment that had modified the compliance threshold. Mirabelle said nothing, but she did open her tote bag and remove a small legal pad. She wrote one line on it. She tore the page out and leaned forward to pass it to Carla. Carla read it. Carla's eyebrows moved approximately 1 millimeter, which in courtroom terms is the equivalent of a full-body flinch. Carla stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to the 2019 amendment to 625, Pausha 5, Lever 204. Where are you getting that from, counsel?" The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Vance turned. He looked at Mirabelle again. This time the look was different. Not dismissive, but recalibrating. Like a man who'd been so certain of the temperature in a room that he hadn't bothered to check the thermometer, and was now noticing the windows were fogged. "The gallery," he said, "is not participating in these proceedings." "I understand, Your Honor. I'm going to ask the individual in the gallery." He looked directly at Mirabelle, "to please refrain from passing materials to counsel. This is not a collaborative exercise." Several people in the gallery shifted. Mirabelle did not shift. She held Vance's gaze for precisely the amount of time necessary to make clear that she had heard him, understood him, and was choosing, of her own volition, to comply. Then she nodded. Vance turned back to the attorneys, but something had changed in the room. Even Pierce felt it. He glanced back once briefly, in the involuntary way you look toward a sound you can't quite identify. The hearing recessed for 15 minutes. During that time, Mirabelle sat still while the people around her stretched, made quiet phone calls, drifted toward the water fountain in the hallway. Dion, escorted to a side room, looked back at her once through the closing door. She held up one hand. Not a wave, just a flat, steady "I'm here." Carla appeared beside her during the recess, leaning down to speak quietly. "The 2019 amendment, that's not in any of the standard practice guides I use." "It was a quiet update," Mirabelle said. "Went through the legislative session in March that year. Most practitioners didn't catch it until the DeKalb case in 2021 cited it directly." Carla was quiet for a moment. "Are you a lawyer?" "Not in Illinois," Mirabelle said. That wasn't a lie. When proceedings resumed, Pierce had clearly used the recess to do some digging. The air around him was slightly less settled. The particular atmospheric change of a man who has walked confidently into a room and then discovered the furniture had been rearranged. He adjusted his argument, slightly. "Not enough." Carla pressed the amendment. Vance, to his credit, actually pulled up the statutory reference on his bench computer. He read for a moment. The courtroom was very quiet. Then Vance said, in a tone that had lost perhaps 12 degrees of its earlier warmth, "The motion for discovery of the bodycam footage is granted." Carla exhaled carefully. Dion, from the defendant's table, didn't move, but Mirabel saw his right hand, the one resting in his lap out of sight of most of the room, release a tension it had been holding since he walked in. It should have ended there. But Judge Vance was not a man who absorbed corrections gracefully. During the procedural wrap-up, while Pierce and Carla were working out the logistics of the footage request, Vance set down his pen and looked toward the gallery again, directly at Mirabel. Deliberate, sustained. "I want to address something before we conclude," he said. The room went still. This court operates according to specific procedures that exist for good reasons. The integrity of these proceedings depends on clearly defined roles. Counsel represents parties. The gallery observes. He paused. When someone takes it upon themselves to insert themselves into legal proceedings, without standing, without credentials recognized by this court, it creates a problem, regardless of their intentions. He let that sit. Then he said, and Mirabel would remember the exact cadence of this for a long time, "I hope whoever felt moved to participate today understands that good intentions do not substitute for proper authority." A few people in the gallery looked at her. Some looked away quickly, the way people look away from something embarrassing. A few didn't look away at all, and something in their eyes said, "I see what he's doing." Mirabel sat with her hands folded. She looked at Judge Roland Vance, and she said, at a volume that was perfectly calibrated to carry in the room without being theatrical, "I understand, Your Honor. Although I'd note that proper authority is exactly the question at hand." Vance's chin lifted slightly. "I'm sorry. You suggested that good intentions don't substitute for proper authority. I agree with you entirely. That's precisely why the statutory amendment matters. It defines the authority under which your ruling should be made, not intention, authority. And the authority in this case supports the motion." The room was completely still. Pierce was looking at his notepad like it contained something very interesting. Carla was looking at the table. The court reporter's fingers were paused above the keys. Vance stared at Mirabel for a long moment. "I have already granted the motion." "Yes, you have," she said. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise." Another silence. Then Vance said, with something that was not quite controlled, "And what exactly qualifies you to offer commentary on statutory interpretation in my courtroom, ma'am?" He said ma'am the way some men say it, not as courtesy, but as reduction, as a way of placing someone in a box labeled civilian, layperson, someone who should know their station. Mirabel reached into her canvas tote. She removed a folded document. She stood up. "I apologize for not introducing myself at the outset, Your Honor. I didn't think it was relevant to a routine hearing." She unfolded the document and held it for the room. Not theatrically, not triumphantly, but with the simple directness of someone presenting a fact. "My name is Mirabel Osei. I currently serve as an Associate Justice of the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. My chambers are 40 minutes from this courthouse." She refolded the document. "I came today as family. Nothing more. I had no intention of participating." A pause. "But I wasn't going to sit quietly while a statutory citation went incomplete." The room did not make a sound. Vance had gone very still. The way a man goes still not from composure, but from the sudden cessation of all the assumptions that had been moving through him. Pierce was no longer looking at his notepad. Carla Sims had one hand pressed flat against the defense table. In the gallery, the woman with the manila folder had both hands pressed to her mouth. Mirabel sat back down. She did not wait for Vance to respond. She did not look to see how he was holding his face. She turned and looked at Dion, who was looking at her with an expression she had no name for. It was too large for any single word, something between "how did I not know this?" and of course it was always you. She gave him the same small nod she had given him when he walked in. He gave her one back. What followed was not dramatic. Courts resist drama the same way they resist speed, structurally, procedurally, by design. There were no gasps from Vance, no apologies, no moment of theatrical collapse. He was a judge, and judges, even bad ones, know how to maintain a surface. But the surface was different now. He finished the procedural wrap-up in a tone that had been sanded of its earlier condescension. He confirmed the discovery ruling twice, once more than necessary. He addressed Carla by her full name rather than just counsel. Small adjustments. The kind you make when you've realized, mid-game, that you've been playing against someone who wasn't showing their full hand. When Vance finally rose to exit, he paused, almost imperceptibly, at the door to his chambers. Not long. Not meaningfully, perhaps, but long enough. Mirabelle did not watch him go. Outside in the hallway, Carla caught up to her near the elevator bank. "Justice Osi." She said it like she was still adjusting to the weight of the words. "Carla," Mirabelle said, "you did good work in there. The motion was solid. I didn't. I had no idea who you were. You weren't supposed to. You were doing your job." Mirabelle adjusted the strap of her tote. "The amendment is in the supplemental materials from the 2021 Illinois Bar update. You might want to add it to your research kit." Carla nodded, still slightly stunned. Then she said, "Can I ask, why didn't you say anything earlier? When he lectured me about church socials?" "Yes." Mirabelle was quiet for a moment. She watched a young man in the hallway, maybe 19-20, speaking quietly into his phone, pressing his free hand against the wall like he needed the steadiness of it. "Because the point wasn't me," she said. "The point was Dion. The point was the statute. The point was making sure the right ruling happened." She looked back at Carla. "If I'd said who I was the moment he looked at me wrong, the story becomes about that. About whether he embarrassed himself. About the performance of it." She paused. "That doesn't help Dion. It just makes people feel something." Carla was quiet. "Help people be something," Mirabelle said. "That's harder." Dion found her in the lobby. They didn't hug immediately. They were both people who processed before they responded, which was something they shared, something that went back to Sunday dinners at his grandmother's house, where silence was not absence but presence. They stood for a moment, just looking at each other. Then Dion said, "Auntie, you could have led with that." Mirabelle laughed, a real one, the kind that creased her eyes. "And miss watching you sit up straight for 45 minutes. "I don't think so," he shook his head. "You doing okay?" she asked. "Better now." "Good." She touched his arm briefly. "The footage is going to help. Carla knows what to do with it. You trust her?" "Yeah. I do." "Then, trust her." She picked up her tote. "I'll be back when it matters." He watched her walk toward the lobby doors. The second-hand blazer, the canvas bag, the unhurried stride of a woman who had never once needed the room to know who she was. Outside, the Chicago winter was doing what Chicago winter does. The wind coming off the lake with that particular personal quality, as if it had been waiting specifically for you. Mirabelle pulled her collar up and walked to her car. She sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about what Vance's face had looked like in that half-second after she stood up. Not shame, exactly. Not remorse. Something prior to both. A recognition that the categories he'd been sorting people into were inadequate. That the woman he'd placed in the box, labeled gallery, untrained, irrelevant, had been sitting on the federal bench for 9 years. She thought about all the people in that courtroom who had no federal judgeship in their pocket. All the people who got the same tone, the same look, the same ma'am, and who had no document to unfold. Who had nothing to change the temperature of the room. Who just had their word and their dignity, and the hope that the system they'd been told to trust would hold them fairly. She thought about that for a long time. Then she started the engine and pulled out of the parking structure into the grey winter light, heading north on Clark Street, back toward Evanston, back toward her chambers, back toward the 8 pending cases, and the 2 clerks and the stack of briefs on her desk. All the work that never stopped being necessary. All the quiet labor of making the law mean what it said it meant. The city moved around her. Ordinary Tuesday traffic, a bus making a left turn, a delivery driver double parked with his hazards on, 2 women laughing on a corner outside a coffee shop, their breath visible in the cold. Mirabelle turned on the radio, found a station playing something with a low, steady rhythm. Drove. She had never needed the room to know who she was. But she remembered, clearly and always, what it had cost her to get there. What it had cost the people who came before her and cleared some small portion of the road. What it still cost every day, in rooms where the temperature dropped when the wrong kind of person walked in. She remembered because remembering was not optional. It was the whole point.